morning, party people, and welcome to Office Hours. It's the show where I go through your questions that you posted over at PollGab, answer the highest voted ones, and provoke some discussions there. Oh, I got to start my question recorder too, make sure that actually catches them. Connie says, good afternoon from Nottinghamshire. I see D. Sanchez in here as well. So let's go hop into y'all's questions and go see what's going on. The first one I'm actually kind of excited about. So the first one is Junior Wannabe DBA says, hi Brent, recently you talked about linters. Do you recommend any for T-SQL? I tried a few randomly for Google search and they are useless. So one of the things that I really like a lot about when you find a hole in the market, like if you go and Google for something and you don't find good answers, that's a sign for you that you, not to build the tool. Building the tool sucks. I hear you. Building stuff and trying to support it publicly is a giant pain in the rear. But it's a sign that you should be writing a blog because other people are looking for the same thing and there aren't good answers out there. Oh, I tell you what, I can't bang this drum often enough that everybody out in tech, if you have the capability, you should be writing a blog. Because when it's time for people to hire you, one of the coolest pieces of evidence that they can do is go Google your name and then immediately go see the things that you've written. You don't have to be the best. You don't have to be the one with the most history. You just have to have some kind of online presence that goes back through the years, and then whammo, you're ranked right up at the top of their hiring candidates because everybody that you're up against doesn't have one. And besides, there's always ChatGPT, right? It can write your own blog posts for you. Kind of have a laugh about there was about 40. There's a publisher out there who has 40 to 50 books that were published this year on Amazon entirely using ChatGPT. You can see inside the book reviews, it says that people have posted videos inside the book showing things like, as an AI, I can't do this, this, and this, but here's some. Clearly, this person was just having ChatGPT write all their book content for them and then put it up online on Amazon. I found that absolutely awesome. General Concativity says, so are these pajama pants or golf pants? These are just shorts, not pants. I mean, it is Nevada. It's like, I think it gets up to 90 today, 85, 90, somewhere inside there. So it's the heat is no joke. So to answer the question here, so the first thing that I always push people is when you Google for something you don't find a good answer, that's a reminder that you should be blogging. So to answer the question, I don't use linters personally, so I have no experience with them. For me, I don't think that they're terribly valuable. The person who asked the question said, oh, I'm just looking for something that would automatically tell me if there are anti-patterns inside the code. Or they were looking for lists of things to look for anti-patterns inside the code. I don't think any of them are all that valuable. But if you want something to just automatically put a small barrier up in front of developers to say, hey, did you think about this? That's one tool to do it. Generally, those things are open source. So if there's something that you wanted to contribute or improve, you'd be welcome to. So you might ask, Brent, what do you do instead? I am rarely involved in the development of new code. I'm a lot like an emergency room surgeon these days. Like people come to me when they're covered in blood and the thing that was bad has already happened. And it's my job to batch them together as quickly as possible and send them on their merry way. They may need long-term help, but odds are they're going to get that long-term help for someone who's more like a physical therapist of SQL Server, someone who works with them on a longer-term basis and is a much lower rate. D. Sanchez says, awesome t-shirt. Thank you. I got a huge laugh out of this when I saw it. So my clothing purchases break down into two categories. One category is t-shirts that I see on Instagram. I'm a real sucker for those, like funny t-shirts that I see on Instagram. And the other extreme is high fashion clothing, like Gucci, Fendi, Versace, Louis Vuitton. Louis Vuitton is the thing that I'm into most these days. We're talking about two extremes between the two. Oh, Mazer asks a question. Feel free to put the question in the URL on the screen there, and then we'll go through them. I just want to track them to make sure I hit them in order and hit everybody's questions. Next up, Rajiv asks, what's the best way to read JSON data in SQL? What I think you mean is parse JSON data in SQL. Because if all you need to do is read it, you just select it out. Just store it as, if you want to store it as JSON, XML, whatever you want to store it as, and then just select it back out. Boom, we're done. You do your processing in the application. But if you want to do processing in SQL, don't. Don't do that. SQL Server is $2,000 a core for Standard Edition, $7,000 a core for Enterprise Edition. Don't use the really expensive server to do parsing that you could do for free in applications. Applications make so much more sense for that. So the question's kind of like, how do I punch myself in the junk as the best way possible? Don't do that. Don't punch yourself in the junk. Sometimes my job here is to remind you that punching yourself in the junk in a database server is an expensive and ugly proposition. Good morning, Ashish. Let's see here. Let's move the screen around a little bit here so I can get these a little easier. Good morning, Eli. Let's see here. Next question comes from not Kevin Mitnick, who says, what percentage of your clients use TDE versus Always Encrypted versus nothing? I don't keep any kind of percentages on those, and I don't do security work, so I'm kind of a bad person to ask for like wider outspread in the market. It says, accept your survey, there seems to be no public data on usage. Yeah, can you imagine why that is? Imagine asking companies if they encrypt personally identifiable data. Oh, yeah, sure, you betcha. Oh, we use industry-leading techniques. Is this microphone on? This is recorded, right? Oh, just the best techniques ever. So you're not really going to get accurate answers out there. Next up, let's see here. ProochingMan? ProochingMan asks, is your Office Hours podcast still available anywhere? No. So we did it going for like the last 10 years, and we've done it off and on for like 10 years. And the problem with podcasting is that we had to pay per month for hosting. It just didn't seem worth it, especially when the pandemic hit and people just weren't driving anywhere. You know, video was the much easier way to go. Way more people doing YouTube, Twitch, TikTok, etc. So I didn't really see a value in continually hosting the old stuff out there. You can find some of it on YouTube, like if you go to our YouTube channel and search back through there. Next up, Benji asks, what is your opinion of using Azure File Shares to host SQL Server data files? I think it's incredibly stupid. Like massively stupid. Jaw-droppingly dumb. Now, technically, it's a way to do failover clustered instances up in the cloud. And so when you see people doing this, it's usually because they want to forklift old techniques and move them up into the cloud. The problem is that technology just makes no sense in the cloud at all. You're so much better off using always-on availability groups. Or if you have the kind of server that is best suited for failover clustered instances, 100 terabyte database, needs high availability, etc., then you're better off, I hate to say this, not in the cloud. Because doing a table scan against a multi-terabyte table when the data is hosted in Azure SMB File Shares is going to be slow. I would much prefer using either locally attached storage like ephemeral storage or conventional Azure premium storage or whatever the new premium replacement is these days. Faster, cheaper, easier, all that stuff. Next up, don't be afraid. That's a really cool acronym for DBA. I don't think I've heard that one before. It says, hi Brent, how bad is spilling to tempdb for sorts? It's kind of like asking, how long is a piece of string? You're not really going to get any kind of good answer there. What if the server's really fast? What if you're not having any performance problems? What if, on the other hand, the SQL Server's only got 16 gigs of RAM and the storage is really slow and you're trying to host a data warehouse and people are trying to sort a 100 million row table and you don't have enough RAM and spilling to disk is going to suck pretty bad? How bad is a symptom isn't really a fair question to ask. What you want to do instead is go look at, okay, in this query, what is the number one bottleneck stopping me from going faster? And I teach you how to do those kinds of things in my Mastering Query Tuning class, in my Mastering Server Tuning class, and so forth. Especially because you mentioned you're not having any issues. If you're not having any issues and users aren't unhappy, leave it. Go find a thing that users are unhappy about. A query never gave a person a raise. No query ever called you into its office and said, "Don't be afraid, I got great news. You did a fantastic job tuning me. I'm going to give you a 5% raise. Keep up the great work." No, human beings give you raises. So go find the thing that the human beings are pissed about and go work on that. It's great that you want to understand. That's fantastic. I really like it. Curiosity is absolutely good. But if there's no pain and you're just curious about something, that's the sign that it's time for you to go to a training class. Go to a training class or read a book before the urgency strikes you, and then that way you won't have to pay expensive people like me for consulting. I'm actually a huge fan of that. I actually want people to learn proactively, go watch YouTube videos, take training classes, etc. But those are full-blown training classes. Y'all are talking about over in chat about the terrible problems of crystal reports, business objects. I totally feel your pain. I couldn't stand that thing. Now, I haven't used it in probably 15 years. Maybe it's amazing now. I doubt it. I doubt it pretty bad. Next up, Eduardo asks, is the cost and complexity of distributed availability groups ever worth it? Yes, totally. I want to say, if I remember right, Stack Overflow, DBA Stack Overflow still uses them too as well. Eduardo asks, do you get to work on DAGs with your clients? I don't do availability groups work anymore at all. Here's the thing. A couple of versions ago, SQL Server 2017, I believe it was, when Microsoft said that they wanted to bring out availability groups on Linux, I was like, you know what? I'm out. And it's nothing against Linux. I like the idea of Linux. I run a Mac. I originally moved to Mac because I wanted to start knowing more about FreeBSD, Unix, all that. The problem is the scope of availability groups and distributed availability groups and basic availability groups, it's gotten so large without the tools to troubleshoot it. The documentation isn't detailed enough. The tools are shabby. They keep bringing out brand new features and no ability to troubleshoot them when they go wrong. DAGs are a great example of that. Plus, as a consultant, I don't want to be on call for emergencies. My idea of a good job is to get paid a high amount of money, 9 to 5, or whatever hours I choose to work, or be able to work completely disconnected. Being on call is my kryptonite. I hate being on call. I don't want my phone to ring. I want to be able to leave my phone behind and not have to deal with it at all. But with availability groups, the place where the top money is at is doing troubleshooting in emergency when they go wrong. And of course, if I wanted to make that money, then I'd have to be on call and doing emergency work 24/7. I got better things to do. Like, coming up in 2 weeks, I'm going on my next cruise. I'm going on a cruise to Alaska. Going back, I've been there so many times. Hi, Super Cyberall. Hi, Santa Fe. I've been to Alaska so many times. I absolutely love it. It's just so impressive every time. I feel like such a small human being when I'm there. It's really inspirational. I really love it. So I'm going back, cruising out of San Francisco this time. It's my first time ever doing that. Cruising out of San Francisco, doing a 10-day cruise. So there's a couple of sea days first, then you go through Alaska, then a couple of sea days at the end when they come back to San Francisco. Really love that kind of thing. And my life is able to do that. Goodness gracious, hold on. My life is able to do that now because I'm not on call. Back when I was on call, it was like pulling teeth, trying to be able to get off for 2 weeks straight. This is also really cool, too. Modern cruise ships, because they, especially after the COVID years, they don't want to use keys or codes where people touch things, like having to give your key card to the bartender. So these days they use RFIDs. They use these slick little RFIDs. So when you walk up to your room, the door automatically unlocks. It says like "Welcome Brent" on the door, on a little display next to the door. When you go to the bar to order a drink, the bartenders have little displays that show where each person is at. So they just see, okay, there's Mr. Ozar. Oh, he likes gin and tonics. Mr. Ozar, would you like another Hendrix gin and tonics? Not that I only drink Hendrix. I drink a lot of other stuff. That was just the first brand that came to mind. And so presto, all of a sudden, that makes life way easier. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to have physical contact. It's really, really slick. Super Cyberall says, an answer to availability groups, move to RDS with multi-AZ. Remind me, can you span regions yet? Oh. So as long as you don't mind having everything go down when one region goes down, you're fine. Now, right about now, you're going, well, but regions never go down. As we speak, Google Cloud in Europe, over in Paris, has an outage of an entire region. So if you have multi-AZ failover, you just have fail, not failover. So, not that I don't like RDS, I do. Next up, Marcus the German asks, I have a table A with an nvarchar column. If I query the data type, max length of 510 bytes, what's the big deal? I don't have a big deal. You're the one who called it a big deal. I think you might be talking about the double size thing. In order to handle Unicode, it takes twice the storage space, thus the 510 bytes instead of 255. But to me, frankly, that's still a small deal. Next up, Dollop asks, taking some of the recent questions that have popped into here, what's a good book to learn query tuning? If you go to brentozar.com/go/books, brentozar.com/go/books, I have my recommendations in there. You'll notice that they haven't been updated in the last several years. That's because effectively the contents of those haven't changed that much in the last several years either. The things that were true about tuning queries 5 years ago are still true today. All right, we'll take an ad break here and we'll be back in 90 seconds. So, for those of you who are still with me, the reason why you're still here is that you subscribed with Twitch. So thank you. I love you. That's fantastic because those poor suckers who didn't subscribe, they are having to deal with the ads. The way that Twitch works is I have to run ads every so many minutes. So like right now I'm running a 90-second ad break so that those poor schmucks who didn't subscribe, they have to go see the ads while we go on and we hit the next question. Next question, Accidental DBA asks the same same question around internals. Carpediem asks, do you have some book or link highlighting or recommendations for implementing highlighting? Hit highlighting with full text search. Highlighting is something that would be done on the front end, not inside SQL Server itself. You don't want SQL Server analyzing those strings and putting in HTML tags, for example. That would be something that you would want to do over on the front end. SQL Server's full text search is just useful for grabbing a specific question or specific strings out of there, and then on the front end you go do the highlighting. I would even argue that SQL Server's full text isn't phenomenal in terms of query performance. If you search on brentozar.com for full text performance, you'll see why and why some of my clients have had to move out of it due to problems with it. All right, ad break over. For those of you who didn't get to see that hidden question or that last question there, that's because you weren't subscribed with Twitch. If you want to go ahead and subscribe, you can subscribe for free with Amazon Prime too as well. Next up, we have Vishnu who says, what is your opinion of agreeing to automatically send SQL mini dumps to Microsoft? Vishnu, I'll answer that with a question. What's in a mini dump? If you don't know, let me turn around and ask you then. Are you okay with sending things you don't know about your databases, about your queries, about the table contents, about statistics contents to Microsoft. Some companies are. A lot of companies are completely okay with it because they're not really dealing with anything private. Other companies, especially ones that are facing privacy regulations, are savvy about that kind of thing. So for starters, go to learn what's inside a mini dump, and it's things like queries. Select star from patient, where social security number equals 12345. Select star from users, where username equals this and address equals this. There is personally identifiable stuff inside your workloads, so then it's up to you to decide whether or not you're okay with that information leaving your building. Totally your call. Next up, Peter asks, is it okay to patch SQL cumulative updates and Windows updates at the same time, or should they be done separately? In reality, most of the shops that I work with, they can only take a limited number of outage windows. So in order to do that, because patches come so fast and furious, we just have to do everything at the same time. If you're sensitive to outages due to patches going wrong, this is where high availability comes in. What you do is you build yourself, say, a failover clustered instance or an always-on availability group. You patch the passive node first, let that soak in for a couple few days, and when you're confident that it's not blowing chunks, fail over to it. You'll have a 60-second outage or whatever for the time that you fail over. Then, after you've let that new primary bake in for a few days and you're happy or you're confident that it's not blowing chunks still, now that it's got the production workload on it, then you patch the former primary node and get that up to speed. That way you've got a little bit of a parachute on both sides of your patching window, and you only have to take one outage in order to do the patch, which is kind of spiffy. Next up, reporting developer DBA asks, can modifying indexes and using a date as a first column will be advantages so we can use it to pull data in a range versus reading pages by IDs? For that, check out my Mastering Index Tuning class. The prerequisite is fundamentals of index tuning, but after you've gone through fundamentals of index tuning, in Mastering Index Tuning, we teach you how to choose clustering keys for your tables. We teach you when dates make sense. We teach you when identity columns make sense. We even teach you when GUIDs make sense. So that's my Mastering Index Tuning class. Next up, Benji says, what is your opinion of third-party high availability and disaster recovery solutions for SQL Server, such as SIOS DataKeeper? My problem with those is that when they're doing synchronous writes, if you want for every write that happens in your primary data center, you also want to happen in your secondary server, they are single-threaded, one write at a time. That ain't how SQL Server does its writes. SQL Server will throw all kinds of log file writes out across all kinds of files. It'll batch several writes together at once. It'll do very tiny writes, which isn't efficient at all for when you're trying to acknowledge stuff across a WAN. So what those vendors will tell you is, well, if you really need performance, you need to use asynchronous instead so that the writes are batched across. Well, at that point, it's no longer a high availability feature. It's just a disaster recovery feature because you will lose data on failover. So every time that I've gone through that exercise with clients and said, watch what happens when we switch on synchronous protection, and they see the massive slowdown in their workloads, they're like, oh, I get it. This isn't appropriate for us. Now, having said that, my clients tend to be high-performance shops. You don't have any money. That's why you're here watching training on Twitch and YouTube for free, desperate for crumbs of education. You may not have that high performance need that my Moneybucks clients have. You might be fine with these solutions that have to wait to write every write across the WAN. Let's see. Next up, speaking, it's kind of tied in. Maria, that's so cool. Mariángel. I love that name. That's really nifty. Mariángel asks, have you ever seen Windows filter drivers cause data corruption in SQL Server? Yes. What are your tips for preventing data corruption from filter drivers? Don't use them. It's not like you're going to debug the filter driver. It's not like you're going to fix the bugs. When you find the bugs, you're going to find them because there's corruption. So don't use them. There you go. Next up, Boris says, is it easy or hard working in both SQL Server and Postgres? The knowledge that you have in one translates fairly well to the other. If you can write a fast query in SQL Server, you can probably write a fast query in Postgres, or at least your odds are much higher. Having said that, I tell you what, my knowledge on execution plans in SQL Server did not translate well over to Postgres. I still can't read an execution plan. I still can't read an execution plan in Postgres. And you want to know why? It's because I haven't really tried to. I feel guilty saying that, but that's also why I don't do Postgres training. I'm just not that good. For the most part, when we run into problems, I can herp-a-derp my way through and maybe go, well, I think this needs an index, but I don't feel confident reading Postgres execution plans. So I would say it's easy for query authors, it's hard for query tuners, and it would be pretty much impossible for production database administrators. If you wanted to be a production database administrator and be any good across both of those platforms, it'd be really hard. Fortunately, I don't have to because we use Amazon Aurora to do our Postgres, so I don't have to manage things like backups, corruption checking, replication, and so forth. Kind of cool. Janestia says, I haven't done anything in Postgres. Well, there's so many things we haven't done work in. I haven't figured out how to do brain surgery, but that's not going to stop me from offering my opinion. It says, but I'm bummed that it seems to have a few really cool functions that SQL doesn't have. Oh, it's both ways. There are things that Postgres has that Microsoft doesn't. There are things that Microsoft has that Postgres doesn't. So unlogged tables was the one that really got me out of Postgres. I was like, that's amazing. I would love to have unlogged tables because there are some like staging tables that I just don't give a rip about. I don't care anything about resuscitating them if things go back from the dead. TJ asks, hi Brent, how would you go about troubleshooting a query that runs forever and you can't get its actual execution plan? This is such a good question. So the short answer is, number one, look at its estimated execution plan, and number two, look at its T-SQL. And I could stop there, but I love this question for a few different interesting reasons. Let me tell you about the easiest way to do performance tuning. The easiest way to do performance tuning, and we're going to go down to the hardest ways, the easiest, fastest way to do performance tuning is when you can run the query, get the actual plan on the actual server. Sometimes shops say, you can't touch production. You can only have access to the server over here. Okay, let's drop that down a little then. The next easiest way to do performance troubleshooting is when you're running the actual query and getting the actual plan on a different server, especially with a different database. All these databases are the same. The servers are identical. Trust me, they are never, ever, ever identical. One of the biggest problems with that is you're now troubleshooting what may be a different query plan, and the things that you do to make it fast on that server may not work in the production one. Now they might, but they might not, and that's why we're dropping down a level here. The next level down is when you can't run the query and you can't see the query plan. As we start to drop down into these lower levels, the amount of expertise that it requires in order to do this job goes up. Because now you have to be able to look at the query and at a glance understand these are the kinds of things that SQL Server is probably going to struggle with. You have to be able to look at the estimated execution plan and know where the estimates are going wrong. That is why this kind of work, like with this answer, is much harder and takes more time. But the way that I would do it is to look at the estimated plan in the T-SQL to try to understand what anti-patterns are inside of there. And I teach you how to do that in my Mastering Query Tuning class. Next up, I love this question. Ty asks, do you think performance in SQL Server could be faster for one-time execution? If the engine takes time to write logs, design execution plans, is there any way to turn that off so that a heavy query would be faster? If you have a query that's going to be heavy, a query that's going to be hard to execute, I actually want SQL Server to put in more work ahead of time. I want SQL Server to take more time thinking it through. And you know what? If a query is going to be run repeatedly and it's a heavy query, I want SQL Server to do even more work. So I have the opposite question as you, Ty. How could I get SQL Server to do more homework ahead of time for queries that I know are going to suck or are going to be run repeatedly? We don't have those capabilities. SQL Server doesn't know at the time that a query is going to execute whether it's going to run once or whether it's going to run a million times. Now, there are tricks that you can do to shortcut some parts of the process by basically tying SQL Server's hands behind its back. This is the internet, so I know some of you have that particular fetish. The way that you would do that is you would dictate to SQL Server exactly which execution plan it should use. You can do that with Query Store, for example, or just pinning query plans into memory. Telling SQL Server, shut up, it's kind of like putting a gag in SQL Server's mouth. See, you're the one who asks questions on the internet. This stuff goes to dark places. Putting a gag in its mouth, tying its hands behind its back, and next thing you know, instead of SQL Server, you have GIMP Server. It's going to do exactly what you told, sitting down there in the basement in black latex. Ty, you're weird. Next up, Ren asks a really hard question to Google. If you have an AG-enabled server with multiple databases on it in a failover cluster, do all of the databases have to be in the AG in order to failover for patching? Is there any reason not to put a DB on an AG in an AG-enabled server? Great question. So let's say you have a database whose contents you don't care about, which sounds kind of weird to think about, but I'll give you an example. It's a logging table. One of my clients has an error logging table, and when the poop hits the fan, their app will just shove tons of data into that logging table, but they don't need it on failover. In the event that SQL Server fails over from one node to another, they would actually be okay with another logging table just sitting there ready to take incoming log errors. So that's exactly what they do. We have an error log database on each of the servers in the AGs, on each of the servers that are in an AG, but the error log database itself is not in an AG. It just has exactly the same table structures so that whenever we fail over, boom, we can just start writing errors into there without having to worry about high availability or disaster recovery. The drawback with that is that you're going to have to keep those table structures in sync. The way that my client does it is that they go check for the existence of the error log tables, and if the structure is different, it just automatically wipes that table over and starts over from scratch. So there you go. Next up, let's see here. Accidental DBA asks, Guernsey says that's exactly the way you have to configure SharePoint. That's true. Accidental DBA says, what happens if I run two instances on a server? Does each instance get its own memory? Yes, that is exactly true. And he says, do we divide the cores between those? Now you're talking differently in terms of number of cores. Standard edition is capped at 24 physical cores, 48 logical cores. It's rare that I would see people running standard edition on something larger than that. You run into CPU scheduling issues. You could work around those by playing with a configuration setting called affinity masking to set some instances on some cores and other instances on other cores, but it's kind of a pain in the rear. SQL Rage says, I took your advice. Oh my God! Finally! Someone did it! My goodness! Someone actually did what I said! I'm not going to lie to you, as a consultant, one of the most frustrating things is being brought in to fix a problem and then being brought back in 6 months later and have the client say, we did a bunch of stuff trying to resolve the issue. I'm trying to I don't have a glass of water in here. I really need water. I'm going to open the door and keep talking while I put water inside here. I'm going to leave you. One of the most frustrating things as a consultant is for when people call you back like 6 months later and they go, I did exactly what you told me to, and we're still having all these problems. But then I open up their SQL server, and you can probably guess what happened is that they didn't actually do anything that I told them to do, or they did something completely different, and it didn't actually solve the problem, which is always kind of funny to me. But it is frustrating. So SQL Rage continues and says, I took your advice and tested this, and I found that updating all stats with full scan on all tables did not cause the plan to be regenerated. In what scenarios would stats updating cause a plan to recompile? I feel like I'm overlooking something. The places where I would start is the data actually changing? If the data didn't change, if the number of rows affected hasn't changed and the stats haven't changed, SQL Server, depending on the way that you called updating stats to happen, may not actually be updating those stats. Check out the dbcc show statistics command and look at the dates on the statistics before and after. To help trigger that, one thing you can do is start playing around with updating rows or inserting or deleting rows and then triggering update statistics again and go take a look and see what happened. Next up, Hammered by Manager to work on SATA drive says, if two similar procs run from two different databases, will SQL Server keep plans per database? Yes. Every database has its own execution plans cache, which leads to something really funny. If you do fully qualified naming, like you say select star from stackoverflow.dbo.users, SQL Server will actually cache different copies of that plan depending on which database you run it from. If you run it from tempdb, you get one execution plan cached. If you run it from master, you get a different execution plan cached. If you run it from Stack Overflow, you get another execution plan cached. Your follow-up question is going to be, why? Right-click on a database and go into Properties. There's something called Database Scoped Configurations. MacStop can be different. Parameter sniffing can be different. There's all kinds of things that can be set differently on a database level option. And so that's why SQL Server has to cache them independently, among many other cool reasons too. Vishnu asks, what's your opinion of SQL ledger tables? Is this another service broker from Microsoft? That's an interesting way of putting it. Service Broker was a really well-engineered feature that never caught on. And so Microsoft almost never puts any work into it. There's not improvements that come out in each version for Service Broker. Service Broker does what it's supposed to do on the tin, and for the people who use it, they swear by it. Ledger tables are probably a lot like that. It's not that they're bad. They seem to be engineered well from what I saw on the outside. I never ended up using it myself. But I bet it's one of those features that's probably never really going to get any improvements done to it. It just works. And so they'll just kind of set it aside and be done with it. Clock Tower says Service Broker needs more GUI tools to get people into the space. It has one, Quest Toad. Quest Toad for SQL Server had a GUI for Service Broker. But Clock Tower, you knew about Service Broker, and you didn't even know about that GUI. And Quest Toad for SQL Server was free. Kind of sums up the problem, right? Not a lot of people know about Service Broker. Even few of them are inclined to use it. Even fewer of them are inclined to learn how to use it like professionally or perfectly. So it's kind of wild. Sasan says, hi Brent, your mastering classes. It really doesn't matter for an equality search while leading key is turned index first. While I have found that this to be true in terms of the number of reads, it could produce plans with different estimates. Any thoughts? Yes, check out the statistics class. We have a statistics class on YouTube, totally free. It's like 3 hours long. So go to Brento or go to YouTube, search for Brento's R Statistics, and there's a whole set of videos on that where we teach you why that is. Next up, Red Dog says, what are your memories or experiences of SQL Data Services from 2008? I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that was the original name of Azure SQL DB. When Azure SQL DB first came out, it was pretty bad. There were a lot of things that it didn't support. So I remember looking at it and going, okay, that's vaguely interesting, but I'm not going to use that until they start removing some of those limitations. So I don't think that I started using Azure SQL DB for several years after that. So I have no memories of it back in 2008. AK asks, when's the next sale for your courses besides the Black Friday one? I Googled it but did not find the answer. Correct, because when people have sales, do you think they announce them ahead of time? Because if they announced them ahead of time, no one would pay full price. I want to reward people like you who stick around and watch on a regular basis. I don't want to reward those big companies that are just looking for training and they pay full price for whatever it is. So because you're here and it's just you and me, I'll let you in on a secret. The company's anniversary is every year in May. That's how anniversaries work. They're the same time every year. And for the last several years, we have celebrated our anniversary. That's coming up rather soon. Just so happens that brentosr.com will be here for will have been around for 21 years. It's actually been around longer than that, but that's the first blog post that I have out there. I used to write my own blog engine in .NET and Java. And then whenever I moved over to movable type at the time, I just dumped all my past blog posts, so it's kind of fun. Next up, Magnus asks, well, we see forwarded fetches from a proc that makes heavy use of tempdb. It inserts and updates into a temp table before returning the reporting results. Is there a forwarded fetches threshold at which we should be concerned about performance, thousands or millions? So it depends on how often the proc is run and how big that number is. If the proc is only run like by human beings once every 5 minutes, it's not automated, people just go in there now and then, I don't know that I really care. As long as users don't care about performance, I wouldn't proactively go in and do anything about it. But if this is something that's built in, like into the app, it's run on a scheduled basis, it's absolutely getting hammered all the time, then you might even be concerned about thousands. So hopefully that gives you a starting point there. Next up, Programmer asks, what's a reasonable progression for deploying a database for a new project as it grows for a team that shies away from managed closed services but doesn't have experience in managing databases? I don't even understand the question. If you want to reword that question, take your feelings out of it. I had a great manager. Man, he was actually a really terrible manager, but he loved to say, when someone would come running in and start talking to him, I need your help with, there's a client which they're just mean and they're doing this problem with, and he'd say, stop. You have a story. At some time over drinks after hours, I would love to hear the story. What's your question? Take the story out. Reasonable progression, assume negligible budgets as it grows for a team that shies away from. What do you need? What's the pain you're trying to solve? Take anything that's emotional or adjectives out of there. That's a great story at the bar, but for the rest of us, lose it. Greg at BMW, howdy. Gabriel says, if my friend had a work proposal for working some days on an on-call ready schedule, what suggestion would you give him? I don't even understand what the question is. Now you can tell that we're getting down to the really low voted questions, like people aren't upvoting these because I don't think other people understand. See, it's only got one vote next to it. I don't really understand what that question's asking. So that's probably a sign that it's good for us to stop here. Oh, plus we're right at the top of the hour. So we'll stop here. And when you put in questions at PollGab, try to make them answerable. Like, I have this problem, what should I do? I don't even understand if there's a problem. Is your friend unemployed? Then they should take the job. I like work. Work is good because it gives money to pay for toys. Speaking of which, I'm going to go wash my replica Porsche Speedster this morning. I took it on a run from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. It's about a 5-hour drive at the pace that I drive, which is actually slow. Surly Dev, oh, hey, good to see you. I drive kind of slow, especially in that old car. It tops out about like 75 miles an hour. But the entire front is just covered with bugs now because I was driving through the desert in the early hours of the morning. So I got to go out there and wash that thing in preparation for this weekend's car shows. So I will stop here. I hope that y'all had a wonderful morning and learned something, and I will see y'all on the next office hours tomorrow. Actually, I'll see you back in here tomorrow. Adios.